What do we know about some of the estimates or data kind of at our disposal concerning migration? We know, for example, that IOM releases a World Migration Report, and for the most recent one, 2022, it indicates that there's 281 million migrants worldwide. So we know kind of some of these figures are somewhat well known. What we don't know, though, are how many undocumented migrants or people who have irregular migration status are part of those figures or are separate to those figures. We don't know that globally. We don't know how many undocumented migrants are in the EU. We might have some estimates. We also need to know, how do people become undocumented? Do most people become undocumented once they've been first in a regular status and then become irregular? And if we need to know more, what kind of methodologies do we need to develop to estimate how many undocumented migrants there are in any particular city, in a country, in a region, or globally? Once we have these methodologies, how can we evaluate their quality? Because sometimes methodologies might be different. So many of these questions were the ones that researchers, civil society advocates, other stakeholders were asking ourselves more than 15 years ago, when the first EU-funded research project on irregular migration, CLANDESTINO, was run from 2007 to 2009. And these were many of the questions that that project sought to answer. Clandestino produced an inventory of data and estimates on undocumented migrants and selected EU member states, and a database on irregular migration. And the findings from that project 15 years ago were instrumental, because we had estimates then. The estimates at that time were between 2 to 4 million undocumented migrants in the EU. That project was also instrumental because it developed methodologies on how to estimate. But at the same time, they were a snapshot in time. So once they were collected, they still need to update them. So this brings us to our current project, MIRAM, 15 years later, which stands for Measuring Irregular Migration. We have now in this project, I would say, the top researchers in Europe looking at stocks. So who is undocumented at the moment, and flows? How are people becoming undocumented, or how are they changing that status, either returning to their countries of origin or becoming regular? And what is also a hallmark of the MIRAM project is that we have local level actors, so cities and municipalities that are also being formally incorporated into the project and the findings relevant for them. So on today's webinar, we will hear from some of the researchers who are responsible for different work packages in MIRAM. First, I would now like to turn to the researchers working on work package 4, so the irregular migration stocks and local level work. So Dennis Kierans and Lucy Leon from the University of Oxford will first present on stocks, and then we'll look at flows. And then after that, we will have some time for Q&A. This is a meeting style, so you can feel free to raise questions in the chat, or also even raise your hand afterwards. That'll be towards the end. So first, I'll hand it over to Dennis and Lucy. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Michelle. Just allow me to share my screen here. Great. Now, can everybody see that all right? Lovely. Okay. So just to say quickly, this presentation will cover, really in main the work that we've done collecting and assessing national level estimates. And I'll speak to that and then turn over to Lucy, who will speak about some of the local level work that we've also been doing. Carlos Vargas Silva is leading on this work package. He's not available to make this presentation, so we'll be doing that in his stead. So let me go here. So maybe just to kind of give a sense of sort of the purpose and where we're coming at from this work package, really the point of it is to compile different estimates of migrant stocks, irregular migrant stocks, and assess them. So really just to kind of get it out in the open that the point is really not to make new estimates within this work package. It's to look at what exists already and to evaluate that. So we're taking quite a broad definition across the Miram project when it comes to thinking about who kind of counts within this kind of irregular within this sort of irregular framework. And so we're really taking, yes, this broad approach, which covers, of course, those who are, undocumented, but also those who are in precarious status. I'd say practically what that hasn't really come through in the estimates. The estimates primarily do take a much more, I'd say, narrow view on irregularity. We've asked and we've collected and assessed estimates which look at the size, but also characteristics of the different migrant populations, at subgroups, so by gender, by region, even by city, as Lucy will touch on later. And we're really covering quite a significant period of time. So 2008 is when the final sort of clandestino estimates were published. And we're taking that 2008 all the way up to 2023. The way that we did this is, I guess, was really cooperative, sort of acknowledging that the country contexts are so different and require such expertise. We developed guidelines to harmonize the collection of these and assessment of these different estimates. But that was really handed over to the country level rapporteurs who really had that country level knowledge, who had the contacts in government and elsewhere to really be able to pull this together. And then from the point of view of Oxford, we were then kind of coordinating this effort and bringing it all kind of together, really. I'm just going to quickly go over this. What we asked the different rapporteurs to collect is essentially this kind of, as you can see, sort of schema here. We're really asking for the type of information. So is it a stock or a flow estimate? We're asking for the period, the central estimate. If there is a range, we're asking for that. In terms of the group, so this would be, is it all irregular migrants? Is it perhaps undocumented children, if it's a specific nationality that's looked at, and then the data sets that were used to construct the estimate. We're also asking for information, and this is a slight departure in a sense from Clandestino, but we're asking not just for kind of a link to the document and some information, but we're really also looking to see, okay, has there been any use in policymaking too? So that was something that we kind of added on. And then here we have the kind of heart of it, which is the quality assessment rubric, where we're asking the rapporteurs to assign a point, 1 point for a low score and 3 points for a high score against 5 criteria. And then to explain why it kind of meets that criteria or doesn't. And these criteria are accessibility, documentation, reliability, methodology, and data. And I think a lot of this is fairly intuitive in some ways. We do spell it out we try to spell it out quite specifically, but I think you can quite understand. So for example, accessibility. We really want to know, is the data publicly available? So here's an example of kind of how we broke this down for each of the 5 criteria. 3 points would be awarded if all of the raw data is available publicly. You don't need special permissions, none of that. Medium level, 2 points. If the data is there, the raw data is available, but maybe you need to ask permission or have a certification from a National Statistical Office or some other agency to be able to access. And then, of course, 1 as a low quality, being that the data is not available somehow. So we have these points that kind of start to get tabulated for each one of the estimates, and we thought, which is good and which is what we asked for, but we also realized that we needed to come up with some kind of an aggregate score, otherwise it becomes very difficult to parse. And in doing this, what we reflected on the different criteria and realized that some matter a bit more than others in terms of the overall kind of the overall quality of the estimate. And we thought accessibility and data really, while important, are not kind of make or break when it comes to the quality of the estimate overall. So with accessibility, of course, we, as you just saw, we had asked for a score of 2, so to dock the kind of score if you had to apply to an agency for access to the raw data. Okay, and that's fair, but you can easily imagine a situation in which that really doesn't affect the actual quality overall of the estimate itself. And even if the raw data are unavailable, depending on the institution collecting this and putting out this estimate, you may actually feel that the estimate is significantly reliable even without having seen that. Likewise with the data, this kind of criterion was around sort of the whether or not the data sets behind the estimate were biased or required very strong assumptions. And part of this is the reason why we kind of weigh this a little bit less. We kind of give it a half weighting, is because we think that, well, we sort of accept that all data have biases. And in fact, methodological advances can actually help to grapple with and make sense of and in a way account for some of these biases. So we didn't want to make that as critical in the overall assessment. So both accessibility and data were weighted at half. Reliability and methodology, we do think are critical and the most important indicators in terms of thinking about the overall assessment. And so for these, we gave them the full weighting of 1. But we also, oh, here, this would be useful, wouldn't it? We also basically made it so that the minimum of either reliability or methodology is essentially the maximum score that the overall aggregate can receive. So if the reliability is ranked very low, let's say a 1, then the overall score cannot exceed that. So a 1 is low. So if a reliability is ranked low, the aggregate estimate will be ranked low. Likewise, if the methodology is ranked as low quality, the aggregate estimate overall, the whole score will be ranked of low quality, despite, for example, if everything else was actually quite decent. And for documentation, we gave that an even weight of 1 that essentially just reflects that we do think it's important, but we think that the most important aspect of documentation will be on the methodology, which will be captured within the methodological criterion. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to kind of talk about this. But right now, we see that this sort of equation kind of summarizes what I've said. That basically Q being the quality aggregate assessment is equal to half of accessibility plus documentation plus reliability plus methodology plus half of data, and Q cannot exceed essentially the 1/4 of M or R. So I hope that kind of makes sense. And maybe the best way to explain this could be here. So I have a couple of breakdowns just to show as an example. These are the estimates from 2022 and 2023. And here you can see the dimensions, the criteria, and the scores that were given. So for example, Finland, we have a rank 2 in accessibility, a 2 in documentation, a 1 in reliability, a 2 in methodology, and a 1 in data. And it's because it's given that 1 in reliability that the score cannot exceed 4. Now, perhaps this would be also useful in terms of understanding the bands. So the low band is essentially the range for that is 4. Any estimate that it receives 4 is ranked as a low quality assessment, and that is like the lowest point in the range. Medium is above that to 8, and high is above 8 to 12. And you can see here roughly how the all of the data sets that the estimates that we look at kind of are distributed across these bands. So we have about 9%, which were estimated to be, which are assessed to be of low quality, about half medium, and about 40% high quality. And that's out of the 252 different estimates that we looked at over the period. I should also note that, well, Miram covers 22 countries. There were only um, estimates, stock estimates, reported on from 14 countries, which I'll get to in a second. But across time, this is just to see where the kind of distribution is of the estimates that we assessed over time. We can see two really major spikes, I guess you could call them. 2008 is essentially the last reporting year for Clandestino. So we see quite a lot of estimates coming out of that project. And then we have the period 2014 to 2017. And you perhaps, if you're familiar with this subject, you'll know that that's essentially when the Pew Research Center came out with their estimates across for European countries. And you can see that those are primarily of high and medium quality in terms of an aggregate assessment. As you also notice, of course, it sort of tapers the kind of closer to 2023 we get, which is what we were expecting. These estimates are usually done, of course, retrospectively, and so we would expect some of this to fill in over time. So in terms of kind of putting this together as kind of headline top level findings, we decided to show the best and most recent estimates from the period that we looked at, with the caveats, of course, that even estimates that we call good, of good quality, they're certainly subject to uncertainty. And also bearing in mind that although we're putting different estimates up in a table, as I'll show you in 1 second, they're not exactly like for like in terms of comparison. The estimates use different definitions, they use different methodologies, and they cover different years. We also, and just to say quickly, we also do a comparison, which I'll show in a second, to Clandestino. And we also just want to say that while we indicate this change from 2008, it reflects to a certain degree the change between these two estimates. But in terms of an actual accurate picture of migration and irregular migration in the country, we're not making that claim. Here we go. We have the 14 countries for which we received estimates over the period, and we've essentially just color coded these. Green, of course, for good, yellow for medium. We have more recent, as you probably recall from an earlier slide, more recent estimates, for example, for Finland, but they are quite low quality. And so we wanted to make an effort to show, just at the bare minimum, at least medium quality estimates. And these are basically, as I said before, the best quality and most recent. And you can see, of course, that it's not all from 1 year, but it's roughly, there are a number from Pew, but there are also some more recent estimates. And then we have this chart, which basically shows the comparison, the difference basically between the 2008 Clandestino estimates and the most recent estimates that are half decent. And it's quite interesting that, of the 14 countries that we did actually receive estimates from, we have 3 where there was really no change from the Clandestino era, 3 countries. We have 4 where there is a noted increase in the irregular migrant stock. And then we have 7 where there is a noted decrease. Oh, goodness. So that's where we are right now. We are going to shortly be publishing a public database with not just these sort of top line estimates, but all of the estimates for that we received and evaluated. And this will be available on Zenodo. We'll then, after that, be putting this into a data portal, which will be available online on the Miram website, and it'll be much more kind of interactive and sort of easier to access. We'll be working, we are in the process of writing up a working paper, which will provide this sort of top level analysis, but also focus on 4 case study countries, the Netherlands, Spain, the UK, and the US. And then there's a methodology paper, which gets kind of more into the nitty gritty of the data collection process, which will be out shortly as well. I'm going to leave it there, pass on to Lucy.
Thank you, Dennis. So I'm going to be covering the local level data that we collected as part of the project. And we work very much in partnership with a lot of kind of university researchers from different kind of Miram partners who are on the call today, looking at kind of data from municipalities across the UK, Ireland, Netherlands, Italy, Poland, and Canada, but also drawing on learning from the CMISE project, which is the City Initiative on Migrants with Regular Status in Europe, which is a knowledge exchange project that my colleague Miriam Cherty leads on. So as you can see from this, there is a significant scarcity of official local level estimates. And of these estimates, London was actually the only estimate that had actually been commissioned at a city level, and it was publicly used by the cities. The other estimates were either kind of led by researchers or third sector organisations, but not kind of commissioned at a city level. And this is because there's, I guess, significant challenges with collecting local level data. Quite often there was an issue with the kind of lack of consensus on the kind of operational terms. How do you define an irregular migrant? There were issues with reliability in terms of, trying to count a moving target. This is a potentially very mobile and transient population that might be moving from city to city. There were issues, obviously, with the kind of motivation to collect the data, which can often depend on the kind of political leanings or the kind of will or priorities of the city administration. So there were some kind of cities who had kind of made a conscious decision not to collect data because they wanted to protect migrants and they didn't want that data kind of to be misrepresented or kind of inform kind of hostile policies and incite kind of any divisiveness. In other cities and municipalities, there was an issue that it was just no political will budget to support irregular migrants. So therefore, there was no kind of incentive to collect data. And there were also kind of a lot of issues around gaps in data sharing. This is often from kind of national government not sharing data with local government, and also kind of gaps in data sharing across statutory organisations, for example, between the police and local government. And finally, some municipalities are kind of moving towards a more inclusive approach, and not necessarily requesting people's immigration status before providing services. And whilst that can be much more inclusive and people are a lot less fearful about coming forward, it does kind of limit agencies' ability to actually collect data on people's immigration status and kind of provide potential indicators. Dennis, would you mind going to the next slide, please? So we have kind of covered some of the indicators that some municipalities are using to kind of try and develop local policy and practice to generally to kind of just try and map local residents' needs and sometimes as part of their kind of wider agenda when they're looking at kind of addressing local homelessness issues or destitution or improving public health. I won't go into these in kind of lots of detail because I'm kind of conscious of time, but on the left, you can see some of the indicators that were used by municipalities and researchers. And in the green box, some indicators that aren't kind of currently recorded or systematically kind of collected, but could be helpful in terms of kind of trying to estimate the local irregular migrant population. We've got a briefing coming out next week, which has got more details on local level data and some kind of examples of promising practice and implications. But in the meantime, we're kind of more than happy to answer any questions around this as part of the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dennis and Lucy. Those are really interesting presentations and very interesting to see at the end, Lucy, when you go into detail on that last slide, that probably some of those indicators are also the basis for some of the estimates that Dennis was referring to that are also done on the national level, kind of how how do you actually start collecting the information and where do you collect it from? But I'm sure we'll get some feedback on both of your presentations afterwards. And please, this is also an invitation to those watching. If you do have questions, you can already put them in the chat if you'd like. So we can chat as well, and then we'll have a moment afterwards. I'd now like to hand it over to Lelaine Saruno from the University of Maastricht, who will talk about Work Package 5, which is irregular migration flows. So Lelaine, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Michelle. And I think actually Arjen has joined us in the meantime. Oh, there he is. We have some issues with the names displayed, but Arjen will start us off. Arjen, the floor is yours and you can share your screen.
All right, thank you so much. I hope everybody hears me well. Yes, do you hear me? Yes?
Yes, sorry, I didn't
Okay,
see you, Arjen.
you don't see me?
No, I see you now, but I didn't see you because you have
Oh,
Lelaine's
yeah,
name.
there was
Yeah.
some issues with entrance. It's like, okay, so thanks very much. I'm going to share my screen to show you, let me see how this works again in Zoom. That's been a while. Let me look, share screen. Yeah, I have it. So I believe you should see it now. Yeah, okay, great. So yes, so Lelaine and I are going to present some of the findings of Work Package 5 on irregular migration flows. And Lelaine has actually done most of the work, but I have supervised her or given her advice. And what we're going to do is also explain a little bit what Work Package 5 is about, because what we are presenting today is only part of the work package. And then I'll explain a little bit the conceptual, what we call the conceptual foundations of this work package, including the distinction between estimates and indicators. I think it was already mentioned, but I don't think it has been covered, has it? And then Lelaine will explain or talk about the methodological approach and the findings, and also present the conclusion. All right, so this work package consists of a number of components. So the first task is the writing of a working paper, which we will also present today, which addresses the following research question: how are irregular migration flows measured and estimated in the EU and selected other countries, including the US and Canada, and what can be said about the quality of the available indicators and estimates? And then we are also making like a public database of the, especially also the national estimates that we got. There are also some international, indicators. There are also some international indicators, but you will find them on Eurostat mostly, for example. So there's no need to put them there. And then there will be policy brief coming up soon that also identifies promising ways forward. And we have a number of case studies coming up where we look at specific types of irregular migration or forms of irregular migration, such as for the Netherlands, domestic workers from the Philippines, for example, and then see what the data, quantitative data, can say about these types of irregular migration, and also whether it would be important or useful or maybe problematic to measure these aspects of irregular migration. And so this is also meant to learn a little bit more about the limits also of using quantitative indicators or data in this field. So this is for the task we are presenting today. The number of countries that are involved, it's quite impressive, I would say. So there's the EU countries, some transit countries, Canada and the United States. Okay. All right, so some like a small mini lecture on the difference between estimates and indicators can be useful. Because the estimates refer to the to statistical calculation or approximations that quantify both observed and non-observed size of the phenomenon you're interested in. Because well, if you think about stocks, for example, so there's the stock estimates, and not most of these people have not been really observed. Maybe some of these people have been regularized, and that's why you know they were there, or maybe some of the people were registered in certain databases. Maybe some of these people were apprehended. So this is the observed part of the phenomenon, but what the estimate tries to do is to also say something about the unobserved part. So those who have, the people who have not been apprehended, for example, or were not in a certain register. And then, so this is the estimate refers then to the total size, the estimated total size of the phenomenon. And it's also true for stocks. So the let's say, or for flows, let's say you have as one flow indicator apprehensions at the border measured by Frontex. Then this is an observed part of the inflow, geographical inflow, but not everybody who enters irregularly gets stopped or apprehended at the border. So there's also a considerable unobserved part. That's also true for returns. Some people are returning through IOM, for example, or they are deported. But people can also, return themselves without any assistance of organizations, and then the part of that flow is also then unobserved. And when we began carrying out this task, or when we began with the work package, it was quite clear from the beginning that there are not so many flow estimates. So there are very few estimates that really say, okay, so many people are entering, for example, the EU irregularly, like each year. So many are returning in total in each year after having been irregular in the EU. So that's why we also focused on indicators. So most of what we will present pertains to indicators. Then it's maybe important to say something about flows, how we define flows. So irregular migration flows are all the flows that either bring a person into irregularity or out of irregularity. So the inflow is into irregularity, outflow is out of irregularity. And it's important to point out that not all the flows themselves are irregular. So, for example, if a person returns with IOM, and then this is a form of an outflow because but the return itself is not irregular. It's very regular. It's even expected by governments, for example. And then there's a difference between geographic flows, demographic flows, and status-related flows. So geographic flows is what is talked about the most, I guess. So people entering the European Union through irregular means, or in ways that lead to irregularity. Can also be outflows with the returns, and then there are demographic flows that people can enter irregularity through birth or leave it through death. Fortunately, this does not happen so often, but we also learned earlier this week that it does happen. It's also used to estimate the total stock. You can use the data on death to estimate the total stock of irregular migration. And then there are status-related flows, which are related to regularizations, for example. People who are regularized, there's a type of status-related outflow, but also inflow. There are quite a few people who overstay, for example, a tourist visa, or who overstay after a unsuccessful asylum procedure. And in our presentation, we will focus mostly on the geographic and status-related flows, as there's hardly any data on these demographic flows. All right, so this is an overview of indicators that you can imagine for the different types of flows. And then red are the ones, and these are also the ones we're going to focus on, that are present at on Eurostat, because we focused for the international indicators in particular. We focus on Eurostat data because we think they are, in principle, the most promising because they're available for a lot of countries. They're also relatively well documented compared to national indicators, but Elaine will say more about that. So refusals of entry at the border is an indicator for geographic inflow. Border apprehensions are also an indicator of geographic flows. Return decisions and returns, when combined, are an indicator for outflows. And then there's status-related flows like negative asylum decisions. And then we don't see asylum migration as such as a form of irregular migration. That's maybe also important to point out, and that we really focused on flows that are related to irregular stay in the sense of unauthorized stay, where people then stay in a country without permission of the state that claims sovereignty. Sometimes, it is also one of our conclusions, there's still ambiguity in the definition of irregularity. Sometimes also some people see irregular migration as such, or asylum migration as such, as irregular migration, because, well, it's not maybe planned. People do not enter with a residence permit, as is the case with other forms of migration, such as people who come with family reunification permits. But for us, we focused on irregular stay as unauthorized stay. So that's why also for us only negative asylum decisions are relevant, because if when people get rejected in the asylum procedure, it's only then that they risk entering the unauthorized population, so irregular population as unauthorized if they do not return. Yeah, so I think that's my part, Lene.
Thank you, Arjen. Could you please stop the screen share so I can switch to mine? Just give us a moment to do this. It should come up, hopefully now. Okay, so thank you all so much for joining us this afternoon. So I will continue the presentation, and I would like to first discuss the methodological approach. We have two levels of analysis. So one is on the international level, and so we are focusing on Eurostat data, as Arjen has said. So we put it simply as EU level of analysis. And then we also look into country level data, and these are data that has been collected and assessed by our many country rapporteurs. Then to establish the external validity and the reliability of Eurostat data, we also did a quantitative analysis. I will talk a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides. But we basically did a percentage of missing values analysis and an inter-item correlation test. The selection of indicators, so of course, unfortunately, we're not able to kind of analyze all the indicators available on Eurostat, but we focus on 6 indicators. And the reason for the selection of these six indicators is primarily because they are the most widely used indicators. So for example, when in terms of geographic indicators, so the 4 items that you see there on the table, refusals of entry, number of third country nationals found to be illegally present inland because of illegal entry, those ordered to leave, and those who were actually returned. So these are the main indicators used in Eurostat's enforcement of immigration legislation statistics, for example. And then when it comes to status-related flows, the negative at first instance asylum decisions and the withdrawal of status, these are also the most commonly used status-related indicators. Here we're focusing on first instance decisions because I suppose we all know the complexity surrounding the reporting and the determination of in the final instance for asylum decisions. So we decided to focus on the first instance decisions. And then to kind of do a validation or triangulation of our quantitative analysis, we also conducted a qualitative analysis of the country level data, again, received by the rapporteurs. We also compared the data that we have from Eurostat to some other sources. So for example, the annual risk analysis of Frontex, as well as the missing migrants project from the IOM. And finally, we conducted some interviews with policymakers, including Frontex, DG Home, KCMD, and so on. So in this next slide, we show you some of the trends, again, focusing on the 6 indicators. So please take note that this is not the main focus of the working paper. So, but we thought that it is a good idea to share this figure just to indicate, how have trends kind of developed over time between 2008 and 2022. And of course, here, what's important to note is that there is obviously fluctuations in the data, and then there are at least two very pivotal events that have had a big impact on these numbers. And that would be the large scale arrivals from Syria, Afghanistan, and other countries in 2015, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, that started in 2020. Now, as Dennis also already explained earlier, we developed this quality assessment criteria. And in this slide, I'm focusing primarily on the assessment criteria for the indicators. So we analyzed the Eurostat data based on accessibility, documentation, validity, and reliability. And for accessibility and documentation, this is really quite high because, as Ariane also pointed out, these are publicly available data, easily accessible from Eurostat. And there's actually quite a sufficient amount of metadata available. There's also some quality reports available from Eurostat. So in terms of accessibility and documentation, really quite high. But when we did the statistical analysis, again, we did this missing values analysis and the inter-item correlation test. We realized that there are some limitations with regard to the external validity and reliability of the data available for these 6 selected indicators. I'm not gonna go through the analysis this afternoon, but you will see it in the working paper with the calculations. And so generally, the quality is quite high, but then of course, we recognize that there are still some limitations on the data available from Eurostat, including, of course, double counting at the EU level. So for example, when we talk about some of the geographic flow indicators, let's say border apprehensions, these are actually cases, not persons. So if a person has crossed the border or attempted to cross the border multiple times, then that is recorded. And so there may be double counting, maybe even multiple counting at the EU level. There's also undercounting at the country level because of decentralized data collection points. We don't have cohort data, so we're not able to follow, a specific person, for example, when it comes to receiving a return decision and actual returns. We cannot compare data from all the countries. We also have an issue with temporal comparability. And then, of course, a time lag when it comes to the reporting of all these statistics. So moving on, when we just, again, very quickly, an analysis of the country level data. And very soon we will be publishing the public database where anyone who's interested will be able to actually download the numbers and the quality assessment. So that's coming out soon. But just to give you a brief overview of the findings when we look and compare this country level data. So we found out that they largely reflect Eurostat data. There's still a big emphasis on geographic flow indicators, particularly refusals of entry at the external borders, as well as border apprehensions. And many countries also use negative asylum decisions and regularizations for some of the countries, because as we know, not all countries have regularization programs. We still have hardly any data on demographic flows, but we do have some data available on migrant-related deaths and disappearances, and these are the data primarily collected by IOM's MMP and a similar project in the US. So yeah, speaking of data from the US, when we do a comparison between the data from the EU and the data from the US, we readily notice that there's a huge amount of data available from the US. So for many years, the American government, together with specialized research centers working on migration, they've been systematically collecting data on irregular migration. But yeah, as Dennis said, they're kind of not like to like, because the scope of the analysis is very different, the definitions are very different, and therefore they're not necessarily comparable with EU data. But the US is also quite unique and interesting in the context of the present discussion, because while we're focusing a lot on indicators, the US actually has some flow estimates available. And this is courtesy of the work of Robert Warren from the Center of Migration Studies, and he has published quite a bit of information, journal articles on geographic outflows from the US. Okay, and again, this being said, we identified many data gaps also on the country level, including the lack of data on demographic flows, which I already mentioned earlier. There's also a lack of historical data. We have no data on hardly any data on overstayers. For countries like Canada, there is really no specific data, for example, on irregularity. And for the quote-unquote transit countries covered in MIREM, there's an irregular collection of irregular migration data. So that's really data is not systematically collected. And now we've come to the conclusion. So what do we know now in terms of flows 15 years in Clandestino? The Clandestino project basically concluded its final report by saying that most efforts have concentrated on estimating stocks of undocumented migrants rather than flows. So data on flows is really quite complex compared to data on stocks. So 15 years since Clandestino, unfortunately, we still have very few available estimates of irregular flows, but now we have more irregular flow indicators. So the data landscape for the collection of migration statistics has changed considerably since 2008. And if you go to Eurostat, there are now more irregular flow indicators available, also disaggregated in terms of age, sex, country of origin, and so on. But still, the focus really is on geographic flows and to some extent, asylum-related flows. So we think that Eurostat data as a whole is quite good in terms of quality, but we have to be mindful about some persistent issues with regard to validity and reliability. And this is also something that Ariane has mentioned earlier, the ambiguity surrounding definitions and the lack of consensus. Even among scholars, researchers, different stakeholders, this lack of consensus on what precisely constitutes irregular migration could potentially increase the risk of misuse. And we're thinking about collecting data on irregular migration. We always have to also consider, of course, privacy and ethical considerations. So some ways forward, and I'll end in a few seconds. So we definitely recommend investing more resources into quality checks and potentially making cohort data available without compromising privacy considerations, of course. We also recommend supplementing, figures, numbers, quantitative information with qualitative data so that we can validate and triangulate all the information. And finally, maybe consider using accessible informational resources, including educational videos to mitigate the misuse of migration data, particularly for political purposes. Thank you so much, and we'll be very happy to receive feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lelaine and Aryan, for this very comprehensive presentation, and also for going through at the beginning how you also see this difference between estimates and indicators, which is actually key to understanding a lot of your conclusions as well. And also since Clandestino. We have some minutes left, a little less than 10. I don't know if anyone has any questions that you'd like to ask the speakers. And also in the meantime, we'd also like to note that we've put in the chat a MIREM survey on different types of stakeholder collaboration. So please feel free to take a look at that survey, fill it out if you can. I'd like to now hand it over to Robert Bayer from IOM, if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'm so impressed by the effort. I had no idea you were so advanced already. I found out about the consortium relatively recently and imagined that results would come out in several years from now. So fantastic. I can only applaud you. The value to the community is immeasurable. I was wondering, yes, just a little bit more specifically about the availability of the data. It sounds like you have everything compiled already? Are there any additional steps that do you have 100% of what you wanted to compile? Will the final data set, will it be a sort of a continuous time series that also includes data from the previous project? Another question I had was whether you have at all checked whether there's consistency between the flow data and the stock data. So do the differences between stocks and two consecutive years, do they add up to the flow? Probably not, because the definitions are, for all the reasons that you pointed out. But yeah, super interested in data availability, and yes, congratulations again on this effort.
Thank you for that question. I think we'll just take a couple questions and then go back and see who'd like to answer. Diego?
Good afternoon, everybody. Really a big pleasure to be on this call, and a huge congratulations to everybody involved in this piece of work. I'm from South Africa, and of course, irregular migration, like in any part of the world, is a really hot issue that many politicians, many stakeholders are always asking questions about, but through which the calculation for these things is usually very complex and not as straightforward as putting an official at the border post and doing a manual count of who enters with a permit and who does not. So what I wanted to ask was, I do understand and I do recognize that the work done is directed mostly within the European Union. So I'm not going to ask the question as to what kind of what kind of data source do you think other countries should use, but maybe if you could elaborate on what type of approach and what types of data sources are those that you would recommend other countries or countries in other parts of the world use in order to come up with irregular migration estimates, and whether there are some low-hanging fruits, like, for example, starting off with national estimates and gradually working towards creating estimates at a local level, or whether it's feasible to try and approach both simultaneously. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those questions. We only have about 5 minutes left, so I'd like to hand it now over to the panel. Maybe we start with Dennis and Lucy, maybe, or I don't know who would like to start, and then in terms of any of those questions that you'd like to provide some answer to.
Okay, Lucy, shall I take a first stab? Okay. Did we get everything we wanted? I mean, honestly, I think what we received from the national rapporteurs was actually much more than I was expecting would come through, to be totally frank, which was great. But I'm not sure if that's just a reflection of like my like low expectations of the field, like what was going to be out there. And so take that as you know, as it is. The database for stocks, the stock estimates, does include the final estimates from Clandestino in 2008, but it's an interesting point whether or not to link even the earlier ones, and so that's noted. But as it stands, no, it picks up in 2008. So there was that 1 year of overlap, the last year of Clandestino and the first year of Miram. In terms of the kind of relationship between like an analysis between like the relationship between stocks and flows, we haven't really dug into that. What we have put together for stocks is assessment of estimates, and primarily what is, I won't speak too much about what the flow, but it's primarily on indicators. So I suppose there's a kind of a missing piece there already that you may like, either we would want to take and analyze kind of the indicators for the stock estimates to make that kind of link to the indicators for the flow for the flows, or I'm not quite sure. So I think there is a kind of a disjunct there, but that's fine. I think that because we will be publishing all of this information publicly, and you asked a bit about the availability, that this will all be made very clear, and we welcome, of course, like the research community more broadly to further analyze and draw conclusions and interrogate this data. And then just quickly to respond to Diego's comment, it's not enough time to really get into this, but basically there are a handful of methods that are typically used, and it depends on the kind of data availability in the country. So you see different methods being used, for example, where there's a population register available. So where in countries without a population register, that limits the different types of approaches that can be taken. And so I'd be happy to chat with you about this, and anyone else certainly offline, but I'm conscious of time. And hopefully there'll be a little bit of discussion in the working paper too. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. Lucy?
I'll just add kind of quickly, because I'm conscious of time, and know it'd probably be good to speak to Arjen and Elaine as well. In terms of local level data, it was incredibly hard to find people who were willing to speak to us and who were willing to share data at a municipal level. And people, when we did eventually speak to cities, often it was on an anonymous basis, and we weren't kind of on the agreement that the information they were sharing would not be public. So it was kind of quite a challenge. In terms of whether to kind of go for a kind of local approach as well at the same time as the national approach, I guess we've got the example of Scotland, which is one of the promising practices, where this is not so much in terms of kind of trying to define the numbers of regular migrants, but Scotland have an Ending Destitution Together strategy, which essentially kind of wants to look at how people are destitute regardless of their immigration status. And so what they're doing is this is the third year now, they're doing an annual survey of all Scottish councils to try and collate numbers on people who are kind of destitute due to their irregular migrant status, and using that to kind of come up with a number of people who are destitute because of their immigration status, and kind of providing a breakdown of the different immigration statuses. So that, I guess, essentially is kind of one way that Scotland are going around it. I'll pass over to kind of Elaine and Arjen, who might want to be answering questions too.
Thanks, Lucy. Arjen?
Yeah, maybe I think we had a very interesting presentation earlier this week, where Belgian researchers estimated the irregular migration stock based on death figures. I think that's something that has promise for a lot of countries, because usually authorities record these things quite well. It does require that you know who of those who died were not legally residing, were not in your register or something. I don't know whether South Africa has a population register or some other IDs, who are inhabitants and who are not. But if you have that, then it seems the best way to go, in my view.
Thank you, Arjen. Elaine?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Just very quickly, because again, I'm very conscious of the time. Unfortunately, Clandestino did not exactly collect data on flow indicators. So what we're going to make available is data from 2008 until 2022, or in some cases until 2023. And then in terms of data sources, from the country level data that we've collected, most of the data were provided actually by governments, by national statistical institutes, or by researchers commissioned by the government. In some cases, there are also some institutions like in the US where they're really conducting their own studies on flows, including both estimates and indicators. And finally, as Lucy mentioned, there's also some data available like on the local level from civil society organizations, but the methodology in this case is a little bit less systematic. So and then kind of linking them all together, we really have to be a little bit careful, because again, the issue of reliability and validity is something that we should always consider before we use the data available to us. I'll happy to discuss further. Our contact information is available, I believe, in the working paper, so feel free to reach out, and we're happy to engage further. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm going to hand it over to Albert Krehler, who is the MIRM coordinator, for our final word, because we're also over time, but just for a brief comment and also on the next webinar.
Yeah, And thank you very much, Michelle. I just wanted to point out that there's also work being done in the Miriam project that tries to try out different methods to estimate irregular migrants in across different countries actually. And one of these was already mentioned by Arjen, a method based on mortality statistics and indicators. We're also testing Facebook survey to not so much to estimate the size of the irregular migrant population, but rather to find out information about the conditions of irregular migrants, and several other pilots, and that work is upcoming. It's scheduled for publication should come out sometime in fall. And there's already a review of methods available on the website. I just posted in the chat. And so just stay tuned on this methodological assessment and development that we are doing. Regarding the next webinar, we will have our next webinar on the EU political framework on irregular migration. It's not scheduled yet, but you will receive an email as you registered for this webinar, and you will get information when exactly it will happen. So thanks for joining, and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks so much for our panelists, the inputs, and for your interest, and we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.